Okay, so we're going to get started. First off, there was fair amount of confusion around when the model was due, this thing, right? And my intent was to have it due today, but nobody really figured that out. And I wasn't very good at explaining that, so it's my fault. I'll take the blame for it. So we'll extend it by a week. So it's due a week from today. So that gives you a little bit more time to work on it. If you didn't like yours or want to redo it, you can redo it. You sounded like you didn't like yours. That's why I'm looking at you. That's fine. I apologize for the confusion and for the dates being different online and whatever. So I'll try to make it better the next time we go through. You are responsible for cutting it yourself and scheduling time in the laser cutter to do it with one of the people that will help you do it over there. I used to spend a bunch of time in class teaching you how to use the laser cutter, and luckily we have lab technicians that are hired and paid to do that. So I can just say, go find them and figure out how to cut it. If you bring it in next week or you want to try to cut it today and bring it in, I'm happy to sit down and try to walk through how to assemble it. I do have a video that I recorded last year of assembling it, so you can see it and see kind of how I would go about assembling it. The only thing that can be a little bit of a hang-up is on the sides. If you have a particular piece like this where the curve goes, so you can see that curve there, the side it wouldn't fit unless you back cut the angle of this piece just a little bit. Doesn't take much to do. You just carve it off and then you glue it on, as long as you have a sharp blade. Okay. So anyway, if you want to talk about the specifics of assembling it and you want to bring in your pieces on Monday, I'm happy to sit with any one of you in the back and we'll do it. Okay. You did also just get your assignment 103 handout, right? The third of 4 assignments in the class, besides the final. We're working on a skyscraper. No surprise that we're going to do renderings of a skyscraper. We're also going to do an unrolled surface of your skyscraper so you can see how it would actually come together. I used to make people build the physical model of it. I'm not going to make you do that. So your life gets a little easier. You just have to do the renderings, but you still have to show me the unrolled surface. So we'll talk about that, and I'll show you some examples of the unrolled surface on class next Monday. For today, we're going to do essentially the same thing that we did last class in terms of bringing the model in and working with the sun and the sky and whatever. And to me, this is probably the most valuable piece of what you're going to be doing in terms of really making the renderings realistic. And so what we did last class is we put a sun in the system, and then we assigned a sky that was tied to the sun. And so the sky varied in color from kind of a light whitish blue up to a little bit darker blue, the same as it would be if we were looking outside. But you probably noticed that it was essentially a clear day. There were no clouds. There was no photorealism to the sky. There wasn't anything there. We're going to change that and add some photorealism, and we're going to do that using something called a HDRI background image. And that stands for a high dynamic range image. The high dynamic range portion of it, if you took Architecture 135, the Digital Tools 1 class, we spent a day talking about high dynamic range imagery, but we looked at it more from a artistic standpoint. The purpose here of a high dynamic range image is that it contains a bunch of information that about the exposure of the particular scene that can then be tied to the sun and the camera in the scene, and it will adjust depending on what your exposure is in the background. So it might get lighter or it might get darker, and so you can really have a little bit finer control over it. So we're going to talk through kind of how that process works. I went ahead and just so that you guys know that things happen to me just like they happen to you, I left my flash drives in my pocket, and my wife was really kind and washed my jeans and didn't find the flash drives ahead of time. So they are somewhere in the washing machine, I think. And I was looking for them last night. And so anyway, I have these files, so it's not that big a deal. I have backups of them, but I don't have the most current edition of what I did last class, so I have to redo a few things. It's probably not the end of the world if you guys watch me redo it anyway. So we'll go with it as is. So the first thing in this scene, I already have the background, the San Francisco skyline And I've already placed the same building into my scene, so that part's done. But from here on out, I'm going to actually go through and create the sun again and create the background imagery, etc. I have over here a couple things. One, I'm going to create, let me go ahead and delete this because this was a step ahead of where we need to be. Okay, so I have an environmental layer and I have a sublayer called sun. I might as well stay organized and put it on a sun layer. I'm going to go ahead and go in the V-Ray toolbars here. I'm going to click on sun. And this is going to bring in the V-Ray sun. I want to make sure that I uncheck manual control. And I'm going to scroll down here and type in San Francisco. Right? If you don't, let's say we're doing a model where we don't have the city, right, specifically. Okay, we want to do one in Pleasant Hill, California. Okay? Pleasant Hill's not listed in this list, but San Francisco's awfully close to Pleasant Hill. So pick the biggest city that's close to where you are if you're doing these modeling. So San Francisco's pretty close. And I'm going to come up here, and like I said before, I kind of like the early morning time slot. So I'm going to sow maybe in between 8 and 9 in the morning. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, one of the mistakes that I see over and over is that you don't actually place the sun into the scene. So it's still asking me for something when that dialog box goes away. It's asking me to place the sun. And so I can put it at 0, 0, or I can actually snap it into my scene here. Let me turn off my vertex snap here. And we'll drop it right to the corner of the building. And there's my sun. Okay, it looks exactly like a directional light, but it's much, much stronger in power. Okay? If I wasn't happy with the time of day and I wanted to change it, I can click on the light itself. And a lot of times it's easier to type SEL light than to try to click on a light, so, which stands for select light. And then I can come over to the properties window here, and I can click on this button for modify sun. And if I click on that, I can go back in and adjust the sun properties again. I don't need to do it right now, so we'll leave it right the way it is. Okay? So now the next piece of this is I need to be able to drop in a background image. And so the background image, I can choose from a variety of them. If I go to the Exercise 217 tab here, I can come down here. You can download a sample HDRI file here, which if I right-click and open will be there. I've already saved it on my flash drive, but it'll give you a preview. And let me go ahead and open it. There's the background image that I have some clouds and I have a sun in the scene. I also have a bunch of stuff down below. This is a panoramic image. So if I took this edge and curled it around together, they would meet. Right? Likewise, if I went up to the center of the dome, right, and curled it all together, that would be the very center, and that would be the center at the bottom. So it's a sphere that wraps around your whole model, basically. The only problem with this one, the clouds are great, but there's some trees on the horizon. So if I had a view that looked out that wasn't blocked by buildings, this, in our case, it's blocked by buildings, so it really doesn't matter. But I would see these trees along the edge, which might be a little iffy. If you don't like this, there's a variety of free sources for these HDRI images. If I right-click and open these, you can see them. And so depending on what you were trying to model, you can look through. These are all free examples of HDRIs that you could use, depending on which one looks right. Here's another website that has a bunch of HDRI images that you could use. These happen to all be free. The best high-quality ones, a lot of times people charge for because somebody spent a lot of time creating a really good high-quality one. But for most of what we're doing, we can get away with the lower quality ones, and it'll be just fine. So those are examples. You're welcome to download any one of these and use it. It's the same strategy that I'm going to employ today as we go forward. OK, so I'm going to follow V-Ray 8.24, which is right here. That's going to walk through how to drop the HDRI image into the scene. So like I said, I already downloaded the files, and I believe that I saved them on my flash drive, which is good. So I'm going to jump back over to Rhino, and I'm going to go to my V-Ray options, which is the little O icon, and that'll bring up the V-Ray option editor. And I'm going to once again go to environment. OK, so now I have the skylight and I have the background. Okay? On Monday, we dealt with just the background, and we applied a background texture. We left the skylight the way it was and didn't change it at all. Okay? In reality, right, the sky or the atmosphere, right, has a certain amount of reflection that comes off of it. Right? So if we were to walk outside right now, there's a few little wispy clouds up high. Those reflect light differently than just the deep blue sky. And so we're going to get a little bit different lighting conditions. So this first option for skylight is kind of ambient reflected light that happens. Right? Not direct sunlight, but ambient light. Another way to look at it is if we only had just sunlight and there was no ambient reflected light in a particular scene, if we were to walk outside, our shadows would be pitch black. Right? We wouldn't see any detail in the shadows because it would only be one source of light. It's kind of like, anybody ever been on stage before and had like a spotlight shining on you? Right? If you look at your shadow when you're on stage and there's one big spotlight shining on you, your shadow is perfectly black behind it because that spotlight is the only lighting source. Right? In reality, if we're outside and we cast the shadow, we can see the shadow right here. We can still see the detail that's in the shadow because there's a bunch of reflected light that's also illuminating the scene. So this GI skylight is essentially that reflected light. And so we're going to put something in for the skylight. Instead of just uniform light, we're going to actually make it change because that's realistic. Right? But before we get into skylight, I'm going to concentrate just on the background. And so once again, I'm going to click the little M for background. And I'm going to change, instead of doing text sky, which is what we did last time, I'm going to go up here to text bitmap. And I'm going to go to my HDRI image, which is right here. It's called Cloudy Sky. And I have two different options. I have one that's called the GI, and I have one that's called free. Right? I don't know why they named it free. The GI, and actually I should open these in Photoshop so that you can see them. All right, let me go ahead. Let's open with. Of course not. Why would it open in? I just want you to be able to see these, so bear with me for a second. Come on. Okay, so the Cloudy Sky Free is the full clarity resolution. That's the one I want for the background image because I want to see it clear. So I'll go right here, and when I pick on text bitmap, and of course, let me come back to this. Let me hit cancel. Okay, when I hit text bitmap, it's going to ask me for the file. So I'm going to choose in Cloudy Sky, I'm going to choose Cloudy Sky Free, and I'll go ahead and say open. And if I were to click on preview, I'd see a preview of the image right here. The preview doesn't always work. Depending on the HDRI that you're using, if the file size is really big, the preview will show up as black and white instead of the colored image. But in this case, it works. Now, what's important is I need to scroll down here and I need to change an option. And so if I get to the bottom under UVW, the type is no longer a general channel, it's an environment. Okay, so I changed to UVW general environment. And then I also have to make sure that the mapping type matches the type of image that I have. And so in our case, spherical is the correct mapping type. Right? So the default is just fine. Okay? So I'll go ahead and say OK when that is done. And that's established. So it now has a capital M. Up here under Skylight, I'm going to use this version of the file. If this isn't included with the file, if you don't have a blurry version, you can use the original version. The advantage of the blurry version is it's softening the edges of light, which is more realistic. Right? The reflected light that's coming off doesn't have sharp edges when it casts shadows. Right? It's kind of diffuse. Therefore, this is a better approximation of it. You can, if you know Photoshop, you can go in and put a Gaussian blur on it and then resave it if you want to. But you can get away with just using this image. It would work similarly. But this is a little bit better practice to use the GI version.
Is it the GI the same dimension with the 3D?
It's supposed to be the same dimension. In this case, it doesn't appear that it's coming in as the same dimension in Photoshop, but it's supposed to be the same. The mapping will force it to be the same, ultimately. So if they're different sizes, it's not the end of the world, but it would be nice if they were the same. Okay? So let me jump back into Rhino, and this time I'm going to click on the little M next to GI Skylight. And so I'll click on that. And I'm going to, once again, choose Text Bitmap. And this time I'm going to pick the one that says GI, right, or the blurry one. And so I'll go ahead and say Open. And if I click on Preview, we'll see that it's kind of the blurry version. Okay? Once again, I have to scroll down here and select UVW Environment and make sure that the mapping type is spherical. Okay? And when I click on Preview, it changes slightly. Okay? So I'll go ahead and say OK. And now I have a capital M in both the skylight and the reflection in the background. Okay? So if I were to render, I'd make sure that my physical camera is on, and I'll set my shutter speed at 200. Depending on which HDRI you use, you may have to adjust the shutter speed now, because you're having a different global illumination that's happening in the background. So all that seems pretty good. I'm going to turn on my distributed rendering. And let me find servers and see what's out there for me. And annoying as it is, I have to go through and check some of these. It's like, V-Ray, why can't you just give me a box that says check all? All right, that should be enough. I'm going to go ahead and resolve the servers. And I'll say OK. OK, so I have the distributed rendering on, which is good. And I'm going to go to my output. And I'm not going to do a particularly large output. I'm going to do it relatively small, maybe 640 by 480, so I can give it a test and see how it turns out. So I'll go ahead and close my options. And I'll start the render. Maybe. Yeah. Nope. The white and the black. If you had white and white, it really doesn't make any difference, because that's fine. The map will override any of the color options that are there. So unfortunately, this is the nature of when we get into this piece of V-Ray, the renderings take a little while. So there's always these little breaks as I go through. OK, so there it is finished. And you can see that in the background, I have blue sky now, and I have the clouds, the puffy clouds. And so well, you guys can barely see it, but it's there, I promise, right? But it's much, much too dark. And so this is one of the natures of when we're working with an HDRI background image, is we a lot of times do have to make some adjustments to the background. So I want to show you where those adjustments are. If we go to environment here, right, we have a value that's associated with the background. Right now it's at 1.0. If we want it to get lighter, we're going to increase that number. If we want it to get darker, we're going to decrease that number. So I think, right? Let me jump that up to 3.0, right? And I'll re-render, and we'll see what the end result is. Okay? But before I do that, I want to talk through another thing. And so the background image that we put in has a sun. If I look at the Photoshop version of it right here, we can tell that the sun would be essentially right here, right? And over here, we can tell there's a little bit of shadows on the sides. If I picked out a different HDRI image, we might be able to see the sun even as a little burst of the sun itself. Okay? That sun needs to match up in direction to the sun that I put into my scene. Otherwise, I'll have two sets of shadows, and it won't look right. So we need to do a little bit more work. And so we're going to move from the tutorial that I just went through, the 8.24, to V-Ray 8.26, I think. Yeah, 8.26, which is the HDRI plus sunlight. Okay? And so this involves a little bit more work to basically line up where the sun is in relation to where the shadow is being cast by the V-Ray sun. Okay? So I'm going to walk through how this works, but it is written up here so that you can see it as well. So I'm going to take and turn off my San Francisco city model, right, and also my skyscraper. I'll leave the little block here so that I can kind of have a general orientation of where I am in the scene. Okay? So what I'm going to do is under my environment layer, I'm going to create a new sublayer, and I'm going to call it sphere, and I'll make it active. And I'm going to create a sphere. Right? Doesn't really matter what the size is, and we can actually show it in shaded mode so that I see my little ball here. And I want to make sure that it's sitting up above where the ground plane would be. So let me move this vertically, and we'll sit it up there like that. And I'm also going to, on the same layer, drop in an infinite plane. Right? And unfortunately, in this particular scene, hold on a second. Let me drop in that infinite plane. The infinite plane is way over here. So I'm just going to move it so that it's closer to my objects. Right, something like that. I want the infinite plane to be close to the sphere because I want to be able to cast a shadow straight down onto it from wherever the sun is. And so if I look at where the sun is right now, the shadow should show up right here on that side of it. So let me go ahead and view this in the top view. And in the tutorial, I view it from the side, but I think it's a little bit easier to line it up if we're looking down at the top view. Okay? And so if I have this set up, I want to apply a very, very shiny chrome material to this. Anybody ever been around and you've seen those like lawn ornaments that people put out that are like the silver balls? Maybe you've seen those. That's essentially what I'm creating. I'm creating a mirror that's in the shape of a sphere so that I can see the reflected sky and adjust accordingly. So I'm going to change the material of this to be chrome. And so if I go to materials, and I already have chrome loaded, but you can load in chrome yourself. If you go to load material, go to your flash drive that has that resources, and chrome is listed under metals. By the way, there is also a Dropbox folder that has materials in it as well. So you could go into metal and pick chrome, and you want the shiny, or it's just the regular chrome.vismat, and you'll load that in. Okay, I already have it here. It's basically a super, super reflective material, and I'm going to make sure that that material is assigned to my ball. So I'll go ahead and apply a material to selection, and there it is. I want the infinite plane not to have material. I want it to just be white. Okay? So now, if I click on the render icon, right, and I'm actually, because this is going to render rather quickly, I'm going to turn off my distributed rendering so that we don't have the wait while it gets started. And I'm going to look straight down on my object. Okay? So as I look straight down on this object, we see a very nice, sharp shadow that's there off of this side. But if I look at the mirror ball itself, let's zoom in a little bit, see how I have the bright spot that represents the sun right there? Right? It's the opposite direction of where the shadow would be. Right? This needs to swing all the way around to be on this side of the reflection in the sky. So it's a little bit of a mind game because we're looking at a reflection of the sky. But what I need to do is I need to rotate that around. So I'm going to go to my V-Ray options again. I'm going to click on the little M, or excuse me, the uppercase M, and I'm going to come down here to this UVW, and we see that we have a value for horizontal rotation. Right? I'm going to change that value to an approximate, and we'll start with 180 because it's the opposite, and I'll say OK. And I also have to go back to the GI skylight because the two should match, and change this one to 180. I'll say OK. And now I'll re-render. And so remember, this is what we had before with the sun. When I re-render, the sun's going to come over to the opposite side. You see how the sun changed? Right? And in this case, it's awfully close to being directly opposite where the shadow would be. Right? Maybe it needs to be a little bit less. Maybe it needs to be, maybe 160 or so. You can come back here and adjust 160. One trick is to just adjust the background image, perform your renderings, and then go adjust the GI afterward once you have the correct number so you don't have to keep going. OK, so that was the wrong direction. So let me go back to my options, and instead of 160, let's do it at maybe 200 or 210, something like that. I'll try 200. And that looks awfully close to being dead on. Okay? So once that's done, right, and I have that aligned correctly, remember I have to make sure that the GI matches. So it was at 200, so we'll make it sure that that matches 200. I'll say OK. And now I can go ahead and turn back off the sphere and everything, and turn back on my city, turn back on my skyscraper, and I'll go back to my view. I think I was in perspective 2. Right, so I'm back into my view again, and let's go back and adjust my, we'll turn back on the distributed rendering. Check the box for distributed rendering. And I'm also going to adjust my output so that it's a little bit taller. So we'll set the width at maybe 400, and we'll set the height at maybe 1200. And then we'll go ahead and render again. All right, and so I know this part is the slow part. So. OK, so it finished rather quickly. And so now I have the shadows being cast, and we can see the sky in the background. And like I said, if we need to lighten up that sky, I can come back to my V-Ray options, and I can increase this value even further. So let's go to maybe 5, or let's go to maybe 6. And we'll try to render that again. And so it's a little bit of adjustments. Likewise, we also might have to adjust the physical camera. The 200 seems OK for the bulk of the buildings and my building here. So I'm reasonably happy with that. Right? So once I adjust that, I'll come back and I'll re-render. And so you can see that this process takes a little while, a little bit of fine-tuning. All right, so there it is with a little bit lighter sky. So again, I'm adjusting that sky. So the higher I make this number in my environment, so I'm at 6, the higher I make that number, the lighter the sky is going to be. If I went up to maybe 8, it would probably be about right. You're going to have to make that adjustment as you go forward. The skylight generally is going to stay about 1. It's rare when you need to adjust it. You would adjust it if the shadows were appearing too dark. That would be the time that you'd be primarily adjusting it. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about it. So now that I'm at this phase, I'm going to go ahead and bump up my overall output. And we'll say a width of maybe 1,000 and a height of maybe 3,000. And then I'll give it a little bit more time to do its real render. So I'm doing test renders first in a small format until I get it the way I like it. And then I'll bump up and do a real render. Okay? So you guys today, the key is putting that HDRI background image in place and getting it to show up the way you want it to. I'll come around and be happy to help if you're lost. The hardest part is rotating the images to match with the sphere and looking in the mirror and whatever. So if you get a little lost, just let me know and I'll come and help you through it. So once again, the physical model, this guy, a week from today. Okay?